kuidas siis autentsust kaasaegselt mõtestada ja seda võiks sellest nii-öelda mõelda. Please, Jane.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I didn't understand a word of that, but I'm sure it was all right. Sure she was. Hello everyone, and thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Now I'll be doing this in English. If I talk too fast or there are words you don't quite pick up on, please just let me know. Raise your hand or something is absolutely fine. Ask me to speak slower. But I've been so lucky to start this lineup of what will hopefully be some great conversations about authenticity in museums. So I will be trying to give you a little bit of an introduction into authenticity as a whole, and to some of the dilemmas and challenges that we face when working with such a complex concept as authenticity in our museums. So I would like to take you on a little journey into some of the complexities, the challenges, the discussions that surround authenticity, especially in relation to our visitors. So I hope you're up for that. So let me see if this works. This is what we're going to do today. We'll begin by going back to basic a little bit and have a quick look at what authenticity is. Bear with me, I'll do this quickly. And I also wanted to present a case study that highlights some of the dilemmas and challenges that we face around authenticity, because it is in our daily work that these terms like authenticity, relevance, meaning-making, and so on need to be used. So it makes sense to see them in action, I believe. And I can't wait to hear more about your work over the next days, so please do come and share. That's what conferences is all about. I would love to learn from your work as well. Authenticity is also something we encounter in our meetings with visitors, and visitors might have their own view on authenticity. Now, my main area is interpretation, and this is that peculiar area that operates between academic and historic research and visitor connection, interaction, and participation. This is where the translation, if you like, happens between hardcore research and visitors of all ages and all stages of knowledge. And it is here that we're sometimes faced with some dilemmas and really discussions that deals with the essence of authenticity. And then finally, I wanted to go into a few thoughts about how we can address visitors' expectations of authenticity in our museum work. So I hope you're up for that little trip. All right, so let's start our mission of trying to figure out what authenticity actually means in museums. And I would like to begin by asking you a little bit of a tricky dilemma that I'm sure you have all faced at some point, perhaps when you started out as museums professionals. You know, when you're like visiting a famous museum for the first time, maybe like the Louvre or something in Paris, and you're standing in front of a famous artwork or a famous artifact like the Mona Lisa, the original Leonardo's famous artwork, and you can't help but feel a little, dare I say it, disappointed. You know that feeling? She's not the most impressive piece of art in that museum, is she? And she's so tiny, and there's always a huge crowd of people in front of her. And weirdly, this brings us to today's topics because, yeah, we are drawn to the real, we are drawn to the authentic, we are drawn to the original. And museums are all about the originals. We're so rooted in the thought of the original. And we cannot really bear it when that disappoints us. And this is where authenticity becomes really complicated because obviously, it's not the Mona Lisa's fault that she's so tiny or that she's so popular. There's always a huge crowd of people in front of her. But it does do something to the experience, doesn't it? It does impact how we see the original. And sometimes this doesn't just make us question, okay, what do we actually mean when we talk about authenticity in museums? It also makes us realize, is it just all about having the original? Is that enough to create an authentic connection? Or is there something else at play here? What does it actually mean to create an authentic connection? So I thought, let's start there. Let's look at, we're going to talk a lot about authenticity over the next few days, so I thought let's just start by having a look at what that word actually means. What's the definition of that word? I told you we're going back to basic here. Let's have a look at a dictionary definition first of all. This is from a Cambridge Dictionary. If you look up the word authenticity in Cambridge Dictionary, this is what you get. The quality of being real or true. Real or true. talk about two words that are up for discussion. I think there are probably as many definitions of real and true as there are people on the planet. If you look, try another one. If you look at Oxford English Dictionary, you get something like this. Of undisputed origin, not a copy, okay, this is something we know of in museums, genuine, made or done in the traditional or original way, or in a way that faithfully resembles an original. That's an interesting phrase, that last one. In a way that faithfully resembles an original. That's a rather broad definition. Now, if you look this word up in other dictionaries or online, you get a lot of similar words, something like these. Real or true, integrity, genuine, correct, not wrong, accurate, reliable, and so on and so on and so on. This is a lot of words to try and define just one term. And in a way, it's not so strange, because in many ways, the term authenticity is subjective. The way each museums choose to perceive it in theory as well as in practice is subjective. The way our visitors perceive the word is subjective. What we understand about an original is subjective. In fact, we can even argue, if we go the full line out here, that the concept of a museum is slightly inauthentic, as none of the objects displayed in a museum was made to be seen in a museum. And yet, museums are all about the original. Museums constantly strive to be as authentic as possible. And it's very hard for the authentic to exist without the inauthentic. So what are the challenges here? Why is this term so hard for us to define? Well, if we have a look at some of the sort of basic challenges here for establishing authenticity, obviously what we come up with is something like incomplete historical records. We have gaps in information, and this may create uncertainties about authenticity. This is unavoidable in history. We don't know everything. We have something like restorations, repair, and interventions of objects, often done in order to preserve or stabilize originals. This may create questions of authenticity. We have the classic one, reproductions and copies. Copies where, for example, originals are too fragile to display. We have interpretation and reconstructions, often of historical environments or installations, which may introduce elements of imagination into the communication. We also have something like ethical considerations. Museums face ethical dilemmas regarding acquisition and display of certain objects, particularly those with contested or problematic histories all the time. And this is bound to cause discussion of authenticity. So this brings us a little closer to what some of the challenges are that we are facing as professionals when dealing with authenticity, and especially in relation to objects. But what about context? The context we work with within museums or heritage sites matters immensely for how we perceive and work with authenticity as well. So a few things here, something like the setting. So are we working with objects or perhaps historical experiences or events that we are trying to recreate or display? Your storyline and its intention, your story perspective that you have chosen and why you want to tell the story the way you've chosen. Your place. So the type of museum or heritage site. Is it a museum or a historical place? A historical site is already an original in its own right, so we have to. So what you have done to preserve it and to display it matters as well. Also, the purpose and function of the visitor experience. What do you want to tell? What do you want to show? What do you want to convey to your visitors? What is the experience that you want them to have? And also something like added history, the emotional context, especially in relation to objects, because objects gain a history during their time in a museum, and this impacts the way we look at them. Sometimes we put a lot of emotion or feelings of ownership on objects, and this can complicate our understanding of them, including our sense of authenticity. So, what does historic authenticity look like in a museum or heritage interpretation then? Well, a lot of the time we see interpretation based on historic events where the unknown gaps have been filled using layers of interpretation like learning, fictional stories, educational layers, also elements from modern time, for example. And we can have events like a live interpretation, living history, role plays, live action and role plays, films, literature, games, and so on. And the key is, of course, not to try and pretend that these events are accurate or historically factual, but to make them believable. Now, we know we are not being historically accurate when we are creating living history events, for example, or role plays, but we have to make the events believable, or else visitors are certainly not going to buy into them. Now, I know after me we'll have a talk about how visitors are actually more than willing to accept copies and replicas in museums if they help highlight the story behind the objects. But I just want to stress here how important that point is as well, because visitors are not just more than okay with copies, they're also often more drawn to what we don't know than to what we know. It's the gaps in historical knowledge that create the excitement. There might be a bit of a treasure hunt element going on there. There's a little bit of an Indiana Jones mentality coming in there, but it creates excitement, you know. But I thought, let's have a look at one of the biggest dilemmas we can face when it comes to authenticity. And I would like for you to have a think about a couple of questions here. First of all, what happens if our perceptions of authenticity within our museum clash with the views of our visitors and audiences? What happens if visitors come to visit your museum with an inauthentic experience, with an expectation to experience something that is not real or accurate or facts? Do you stick to your own perception of authenticity as a museum professional? Do you disappoint your visitors, maybe tell them they are wrong? Do you go with their expectations? Do you compromise, whatever compromise look like to you, your belief about authenticity in order to embrace other viewpoints, perhaps? Please keep some of these questions in mind, because I'm sure they're going to pop up again over the next couple of days. And also, I would like to present a case study to you that deals with these issues and these questions. It's from a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in Denmark, where I was hired as an interpretation manager back in 2018. I was there for a couple of years, and I was in charge of historical storytelling and narrative creation. And here I faced this challenge of visitor expectation versus historical accuracy or authenticity. It was at a place called Corbo Castle in Estonia in Denmark. Some of you may have heard of it. Any of you been? Oh, yeah? Fantastic. We'll have a chat afterwards. Now, Corbo Castle is it's based in the town of Estonia in Denmark, just north of Copenhagen. It's now part of the National Museum of Denmark. It's a beautiful old Renaissance castle, a fortification and a stronghold built in 1585, and it's been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since the year 2000. Now, Corbo's location is important. If you're familiar with the geography of Denmark, you have Denmark there to the left, small country, and to the right you have sort of a closer look at the location of Corbo Castle. And as you can see, Corbo is located just where we have the shortest distance between Denmark and Sweden. And the southern part of Sweden used to be Danish, so at one point this was all Denmark. But this position meant that the Øresund Strait, the water that runs between Denmark and Sweden, can be controlled entirely from the castle, from the fortification. And that meant, of course, the Danish kings imposed a tax on all cargo, all ships that went in and out of the strait in order to trade in the Baltic Sea. It made them very rich, I have to say. It was far safer to travel by ship on water than over land. So it's still a very busy water today. A lot of ships still go in and out. And let me just show you another photo here. You have Sweden there in the background. It's a bit easier to see the distance here. The castle there in the middle and some modern buildings, administration's building around it there. Now, in the 1620s, a fire almost destroyed the entire castle. And even though most of the castle was reconstructed exactly as it was, a lot of the interior and furniture and so on was completely destroyed. And that left the castle looking rather empty. So this is a photo from inside the Great Hall, where we still have a few of the original tapestries from the Renaissance, but all furniture and interior of the castle today are copies or furniture from a later period. Now, we chose to use copies and reconstructions simply to fill the rooms a little bit, or else it would be very empty and it would be hard for visitors to sort of get an idea about what the spaces were used for and what they had once included. And you can see a few of the remaining tapestries there, but everything else are copies or furniture from a later period. We also tried to give an impression of the more intimate rooms, like the king's and the queen's chambers, with copies of beds and models with clothes and so on. Apologies, these photos are a little dark. Hope you can see them. Not the best photographer in the world. But because we didn't have a lot of historical artifacts to work with, we tried to bring some history alive by creating dramatized tours where we made a historical character come alive, and this character would then give a tour of the castle and tell visitors about castle life and so on. So we had the headmistress there showing people around. She was called the Mistress of the Robes. That was the housekeeper title. She knew a lot, of course, and a lot of gossip about what went on at court. We had ghost tours, hence the pale expression there on the guardsman's face, and things like that to try and make the castle come a bit alive. Now, Corbo Castle was not just known as a Renaissance castle. In fact, most people come to visit because of a very specific character. I don't know if any of you may have heard of him. Yep. Hamlet. Corbo is also known as Hamlet Castle by a lot of visitors. And in fact, a lot of foreign visitors from Asia, from America, Southern Europe, come to experience what they know as Hamlet's Castle, the tragic story of the Prince of Denmark that was written by Shakespeare sometime around 1600. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to it, the dilemma. And I have to break this to you, I'm sorry, but Hamlet wasn't real. I know, spoiler alert. He never lived. There's never been a Prince Hamlet of Denmark who died tragically after 5 very long acts. And yet, we have people coming from all over the world to see Hamlet's Castle. Now, all silliness aside, this is in a way a fantastic situation to be in, because visitors come to us on their own. Hurrah, that's what you want. But the thing is, they don't come to see you or your site or your Renaissance castle. They come because of a fictional character, someone who never lived. So we have a bit of a challenge here. Let's just have a look at it. We have a very pretty but empty Renaissance castle, and we have probably one of the most well-known fictional stories in the world. Everyone knows about Hamlet. Some people in detail, if you're into Shakespeare. But even if you've never read the story, you probably will have heard of Hamlet. For more than 400 years, this has been a popular story, and it's still told around the world and still put up in theatres. But we don't have any historical remains or objects from Hamlet because they never existed. And yet, this is what attracts visitors. So what's a poor interpretation manager meant to do? Well, let's just have a look at what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do was obviously to get visitors to gain an interest in the Renaissance, in the castle and its history. We wanted to give life to and fill the empty rooms and spaces, and we wanted to tell interesting, amazing, riveting stories that encouraged active participation and learning, but also obviously to exceed visitors' expectations. That's what we all want. We want visitors to leave and go, wow, this was a great experience. So, well, the solution we came up with here was a combination of our own expectations and visitors' expectations. And I'll let you be the judge as to whether you think we compromised authenticity or actually managed to work our way around it here. But the concept we created was known as Hamlet Live, an interactive, real-life, historic live interpretation experience. I'll tell you more about it. So we used real actors in the well-known roles from the play of Hamlet, of Claudius the King, Gertrude the Queen, Ophelia, and so on. Now, it was important that the actors had no problem breaking down the fourth wall, you know, that barrier between actors on stage and spectators. They had to talk to visitors, interact with them, and make them part of the story. And they had to possess historical knowledge about the Renaissance and the castle to be a believable part of the place. So, what was Hamlet Live then? Well, the best way to describe it is that it was an interactive historic experience theatre, and live interpretation experience. So it was based on Shakespeare's original script and language. We used a scriptwriter and a theatre director to rewrite the story and to make it come alive in English for an interactive experience. So it's Shakespeare's characters that come alive at the castle. It's not the full play, but it's scenes from the play in an interactive approach. So we did set up a few actual scenes from the play, mostly because people really like to see this. For example, there are some amazing quotes in the play that we all know about, to be or not to be, the rest is silence, and so on. And we knew visitors wanted to see those. There's a great duel scene at the end, a sword fighting scene. We needed to include that one. But most of the time, the storyline played out with scripted dialogues between actors that allowed for active participation and for visitors' input. And I'll show you some examples in a bit. So visitors had to participate to activate the story. It was important that the castle set the scene. So as many rooms and spaces as possible was included. We wanted it to be a tour of the castle as well. Now, the time, the language, costume, everything around the setup was the period of the Renaissance. So around the time the castle was built and the play was written. And this certainly challenged, actors, historians, interpreters, everyone in a completely new way. History had to be told through fictional characters. Visitors had to be participants. Actors had to improvise and interact and let visitors influence the storyline. And the castle had to be used in a completely new way. So that's a lot to take in. I would like to show you a little video now. It's only about 30 seconds. It's from a trailer that we did during the first season we had Hamlet Live. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of an impression about how it worked on site and what it looked like. I hope this works. Let's see. So the storyline did follow Shakespeare's plays. We didn't suddenly have a happy ending, although visitors could bring their own input. But we had like Ophelia going mad, for example, which she does in the play out of love for Hamlet. We had the king and the queen. We had the jester jumping around, playing with children, and so on. It was important that there was a constant element of interaction. So you could learn to shoot with bow and arrow from Laertes, Ophelia's brother. You could learn to dance a Renaissance dance. You could interact. This photo at the bottom there is from a little rehearsal we had with the actors where we taught them to walk and talk as you did in the Renaissance. You could help Hamlet write love letters to Ophelia and all of that. Now, we obviously had a lot of discussion about this approach of mixing fiction, a fictional story, with a historical place and historical facts. And some of our discussions, I just let you in on some of the questions we had, revolved around questions and dilemmas like these. First of all, is it clear what is fiction and what is real? Do visitors get this, in other words? Of course, most of them did. Most of them know Hamlet is fictional. But it was just important that that was kind of obvious to everyone. Are you compromising authenticity, or are you working with existing platforms and expectations? So in other words, when do you know when you have gone too far in your fictional approach? And what does that look like to you? When do you feel you're not being authentic? How do visitors perceive the experience? What do they take away? This was crucial as we wanted visitors to learn about the history and the Renaissance and the castle. And obviously, can you successfully combine historical facts and fiction into an authentic and believable experience? Well, a lot of the time we felt we could, as long as we stayed true to both the historic side and to the fictional story. We never tried to convince people, obviously, that Hamlet lived. We never said visitors could come and experience the actual play, like you can in a theatre, but they could come and have a fun, engaging, and educational experience, where they could learn about the castle, the Renaissance, and Shakespeare's play through the characters of Hamlet. So we wanted them very much to experience the castle and the Renaissance. we obviously went in and out of these questions quite a lot during this, and we didn't always agree on the approach that we took, but we always agreed on experimenting and trying out. And what it also meant was that we did make a lot of changes. There was a lot of adaptation going on along the way, but we always made sure that there was room for learning, room for mistakes to be made. And we had a real life example that we could sort of hang our discussions around authenticity on. We didn't have like a theoretical, hypothetical discussion around authenticity. We actually had an example we could use to discuss these things from. So this was a huge learning experience for us as well. Now, moving on, there is no doubt that when you venture into methods of interpretation where you can have a closer look, for example, or a deeper experience or knowledge using replicas and copies, we also create room for learning and for new knowledge of the past as well, and we get a chance to create more profound connection between our visitors and the past. There are some interesting examples out there where the real and copies and also fictional layers have been merged and mixed with interpretation and visitor communication. And I like to show you some examples because I think the examples are always really good to talk from. So a few examples of where we have been trying to sort of balance the original and interpretation. So these are taken from a little bit from around the world. But one of the things this can do is, first of all, create an impression of reconstructions and also material testings. So these are opportunities where we can test creation, we can use tools, we can test techniques, fidelity, robustness, and so on of historical objects. You know about these sites where this happens. I've just chosen one here for an example. This is from a small Iron Age village in Denmark where visitors can come and interact with volunteers using tools, making food, and so on. And the great thing about these places is that they often get to test objects, something we can obviously only do with copies. So there's a lot to learn from these places about techniques and use and so on. And they can be really good for creating new understandings and also for letting visitors participate as well. We also get an impression of something like modern adaptations that may lead to new discoveries. I have an example here from, this is a famous Danish rune stones. You have the original there to the right. And this is a so-called picture stone, an image stone, where you have an early image of Christ. The original had colors, but we don't know which exactly. And to the left, you have an artist's modern expression of what it could have looked like. And suddenly we start to see and notice different details from the same image, simply because they stand out visually. You can, of course, do the same with digital imaging. But just by adding colors, you start to get a new impression. Like, for example, this early image of Christ. We're kind of used to, when we see Christ in this position, we're used to seeing him hanging on the cross. And when you add the colors, suddenly you see that this Christ is not hanging on a cross. He's an embracing Christ with his arms open, and he's embracing his people into his flock into Christianity. This is the first reference we have actually of Christianity in Denmark, and this stone is often known as the birth certificate of Denmark. So an interesting modern expression there. It's also possible to get closer to details that you otherwise wouldn't discover. This is an interesting one. This is from an experience called the Sistine Chapel Experience. It was a traveling exhibition. I caught it when it was in London. And it presented these huge original size prints of every fresco in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, put up, as you can see, in the same way they're pictured in the chapel. So some of them on the ceiling above you, some of them on the walls to the side. And the prints were amazingly detailed. You could see every brush stroke, every crack, all the colors, also where they had faded. And of course, you can never get this close to the original. If you've ever been in the Sistine Chapel, you know that ceiling is about 20 meters above you. And again, huge crowds of people, always. But it's very difficult to get this close to the original. And it just presented some great references to the different parts of the Bible and so on, where these stories came from. So a brilliant way of actually getting up close. Of course you miss standing in the actual chapel, but I would actually have loved to see this as kind of part of the Sistine Chapel experience, I have to say. Getting outside the museum, that's a really interesting one, because we're so used to visitors coming to us. Now, I love this next initiative here. This was a great example. It's from, oops, was that this slide? It was from a while ago, back in 2008, in the city of York, in the northern part of England, where a project displayed copies of a series of original paintings, including copies of the frames, around the city centre outside. So you could experience a copy of a painting outside a shop, down by the riverside, outside the parks, and so on. And you may, if you look at the one to the left there, the picture to the left, you may recognize that image there. It's called The Ugly Duchess. It's by the Flemish painter Quentin Matsys. And it was put up, you might be able to see it if you can see the white facade there. It was put up outside a beauty salon. I thought that's a brilliant use of humor. I wish I'd come up with that one. So before you go in to have a facial or have your nails done or something, you pass by this grotesque-looking old woman. I thought that was fantastic. But the surprise on people's faces when they suddenly discover a painting that looks like an original hanging outdoors, that was priceless. And it definitely put a different focus on the paintings and also sparked a lot of curiosities among visitors to go and see the original. So these were a few examples of how copies and replicas can both provide new historical knowledge and also contribute to creating a deeper connection to objects for visitors. Some of these examples were not from museums, but I think it's quite easy to see how they could go well with museum experiences as well and with original objects or historical sites. A really important thing here is being clear about what is historically accurate and what is copies or filling in the gaps with imaginations or guesses. So be clear on your purpose when using replicas and copies. No matter what you're trying to do, make sure that it comes across loud and clearly. As I've mentioned before, visitors don't actually mind copies or replicas. They are okay with us not knowing everything, and this is usually rather exciting for them. It's often the gaps in historical knowledge that attracts the most attention. It's simply what we don't know that's exciting. As long as we are honest and clear about what we know and what we don't, then it's a lot easier to create a clear purpose for engaging with copies and new forms of interpretation. So, you're still awake. Good, brilliant. What about then addressing visitors' expectations of authenticity? Well, a few thoughts. How can we go about this? First of all, embrace visitors' reason and motivation for coming, even when it is wrong or fictional. Even if their perspective is wrong or not historically accurate, it still brought them to you. If your visitors come to see Hamlet, start there, and then build your own historical sources into your expectations. We never once changed the historical facts to accommodate the story of Hamlet, but we did tell a lot of history through the story of Hamlet. Connect historical facts with visitors' knowledge. Obviously, you know this. Don't ever try and tell visitors they are wrong. It rarely goes down well. But build on their knowledge whatever level they might be at. So meet them where they are, even if they have very limited or wrong knowledge. Start with what they know and then build from there. Use visitors' expectation to spark further curiosity. Make them curious about your collections, your exhibitions, the era you're working with. You have their attention now, so make good use of it. And as I've said a couple of times before, be as clear as possible in your storytelling about fiction, added layers of history, modern adaptations or influences and historical facts. When you do start mixing fictions and layers of storytelling, modern influences or adaptations, be as clear as you can about it. Let people know what is research coming from historical sources and remains, and what are added layers of interpretation and storytelling, or perhaps conservation or layers of modern influences. Visitors are okay with guesswork and fiction as long as it's clear why you're using it. I would like to end with this thought. The thing is, we can create most things today. With the technological advances we have today, we can already create more than we can imagine. If you can imagine something, it can certainly be created, and probably much more to it. But the only way to keep our work authentic is to have a clear purpose for why we are creating the storyline, the reconstructions, the events, and so on that we do. Be open and honest about what you know and what you don't know. When we cultivate a culture of openness and honesty within our museums and in our relationship with visitors, then we foster an environment of authenticity. When we are open to creating a space where we can keep discussing, also disagreeing on, and developing terms and practices like authenticity, like relevance, like meaning making, we embrace an environment of authenticity. We also embrace ways of being open for new views and perceptions of authenticity as it changes in the future, and change it will. Original objects can give visitors a sense of connecting with history. Copies, and sometimes fiction, can give visitors a sense of experiencing history. In that way, they both support and complement each other. At the end of the day, the closest to being as authentic as we can ever be is being open and honest about what we do and why we do it. And with that thought, I would like to say thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Don't go away. Thank you, Jane. What an introduction. I will just say one comment in Estonian. Kui te tahate küsimuse esitada eesti keeles, laske julgelt käia, küll me saame kamba peale ära tõlgitud. Aga ajage käsi püsti, meil on mõlemal pool mikrofonid, kes saavad kohe teile kiirelt mikrofonid tuua. Thank you. I think the presentation, I had thought you a question, but I don't know now, will I ask it?
Please do.
Because all the dilemmas what I thought we will have, you made them even bigger. So do we have any hands from the audiences on the questions? Siin ees on kohe.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I would like to know, when you started to examine this authenticity question, at that time when you were in London or when you started in Gronbury?
Oh, interesting question. I think it started already when I started out as a museum professional, because we run into it immediately, don't we? We know that when we are working with objects in a museum, we are working with remains of the past, but we are also working with how we present them to a modern day visitor. And I think it goes within the concept of relevance, that we want to make the stories of the past relevant today. We want to tell our visitors why it is important to learn from the past. So I think we're constantly searching for elements of relevance in our authenticity work as well. So I think it's probably something that we run into very early on as museum professionals. I think am I right? Most museum professionals feel that way. Maybe even back from when we first visited, before we even became professionals, back from when we started visiting museums, and you look at an original for the first time, and you either have a wow feeling, okay, this was something created a long time ago, or maybe you don't. You sort of look at it and go, why should I be interested in this old piece, you know? But no matter what it is, it gives you something. There is something special about going to a museum in itself, and I think we're good at creating that magic overall. So I think, yeah, it probably started way back for me. Thank you.
Siin ees on veel, Kaja?
Thank you very much. So the question goes together with another issue that you were already explaining. And as historians, as museologists, we always would like to be really, into the facts and to present the facts. And you were discussing the Hamlet Castle, because in the end, it's the Hamlet Castle. And probably if you look at Lonely Planet and in different touristic agendas, it's going to be the Hamlet Castle. So how are you able to find this, let's not call it the non-facts which are attracting the tourists? Because, at the end of the year, they're going to ask us, how many tourists, the numbers. And the numbers don't go together with the authenticity of the historical site. They go together with the expectations of the visitors. Yeah. So where are we?
That's a good question.
Yeah, in this debate.
I think the obvious answer is don't try and fight it, because you cannot. Visitors come to see Hamlet's Castle, and that's what they want to see. But I think the approach we also took was that the play of Hamlet is an old play. It was written around 1600, so approximately around the time the castle was built. We don't actually know if Shakespeare was there, but we know some of his players, the actors, the group he traveled around with, was there. So he will have had quite a good first-hand expression of the place. And he has some references in the place as well that corresponds with lots of places within the castle. So the play itself is a piece of history. And I think that was an approach into it that we took, that, okay, we have a historical site that's very empty, but we still have a lot of history we want to tell about it. And the play itself, yes, the characters are fictional, but the play was real. The play was written. It's part of history. And how can we sort of marry those two things together? We kind of knew that the visitor numbers would go up with the introduction of Hamlet Live, and it certainly did quite massively. So we choose to have Hamlet Live as the summer seasonal program, and then we did other things the other year around, like Christmas markets and so on. So I think the key to that is don't try and fight it, because there is something precious in visitors coming to you already. Even as I said, if they know you from something that is wrong or fictional, they still come to you. They are interested. They want to know about this place where Hamlet lived. And once they are there, it's just easier to lure them into that. So in a way, it's an ideal situation. They come to you on their own. And it's so much easier to give them that introduction to a place once they're there. And luckily, I have to say, a lot of visitors were impressed by the place. It is a beautiful, beautiful Renaissance castle once they come there and they start to get interested in, oh, how old is this? And what about the cannons? And what happened in the Great Hall? And so once they're there, it's just a lot easier. Thank you. Are we on time, Magnus?
Yes,
oh,
yes.
Good, thank you.
If there is a hand. Yes, good.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. I have a question. When you were preparing for this Hamlet story and all these discussions, how did you solve all these dilemmas inside the museum team? Because there's part of historians who say, no, leave it. And then you have to prove that it will work. And you will have also your purpose. So how did you solve it?
Good question. We didn't always. That's the truth. We didn't always agree. So the one thing we did agree on was to keep adapting it. It had to be a flexible concept. There had to be room for error. That's the key to that. We had, as you say, some very keen historic researchers who were very keen to keep all the historical research as clear as possible. And we had a theatre director and a script writer who was very into history and knew a lot about, especially the time of Shakespeare. So they were quite into the historical facts already, but obviously that merging was a key thing. One approach we did that seemed to work was that whatever the actors did, whatever they engaged visitors in, had to be historically correct. And that meant diving into some peculiar details sometimes. Everything from the way they looked to what they did, what they talked to visitors about. We had, like, to give you an example, a little discussion around the king, for example, who would play in his chamber, who would play chess with visitors. The game of chess is quite old, so that would have been a board game that would have been invented. Maybe not entirely in according with the rules we know today, but that was something that we could somehow incorporate and look into research-wise. So there were tiny little elements all the time. What did ladies do, for example? What did they occupy their time with, ladies at court, for example? What was the talk about? What was the political discourse like? All of these different societal elements was something that we could start researching. And that seemed to be the key into that. So yes, they were told through Hamlet and the characters of Hamlet, but all the research we did into that was based in historical research and historical facts. But it's a very good question because, no, we didn't always agree. That's the truth to that. But we always agreed on experimenting. And I think when you try something like this, you have to have that approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I can already feel that you brought up very well all the dilemmas, and so we have electricity in the room. Nicely. Meie järgmine ettekanne tuleb veebi vahendusel. Jaa.